20-year-old soldier Vanessa GuillÉN vanished from Fort Hood in April 2020. Her belongings were found, but she was gone without a trace. She had confided fears of harassment, yet never reported them. How could a young woman disappear inside a military base, and what dark truths would her story uncover? On the morning of April 22, 2020, Specialist Vanessa GuillÉN stepped into her workplace at Fort Hood, Texas. The sun was high, soldiers moved about their duties, and nothing seemed unusual. But within hours, her life would take a turn that shocked the nation. Vanessa, only 20 years old, vanished without a trace. Her car keys, her room key, her military ID, even her bank card, all of it was discovered left behind in the armory where she worked. For her family, this was unthinkable. Vanessa was disciplined, responsible, and deeply committed to her service. She would never walk away without her essentials. Something was terribly wrong. Behind the uniform and the proud smile, Vanessa had carried a heavy secret. She had told her family she was being sexually harassed by a superior. She feared retaliation, the kind of silence that can crush a young soldier's voice. She never filed a report. Instead, she tried to bear it, alone. When her family realized she was missing, they demanded answers. But days passed, and questions grew heavier. How could a soldier disappear on one of the largest military bases in the country? Why did the army seem slow to respond? And what exactly had happened to Vanessa inside Fort Hood? Her disappearance sparked something bigger than a search. It ignited a movement. Across the nation, people began to speak out. Survivors of harassment, assault, and silence rallied under one phrase: "I am Vanessa GuillÉN." What began as a desperate search for one young woman was already becoming the spotlight on a culture of fear, silence, and injustice inside the U.S. military. And as her family fought for truth, the world began to ask, who failed Vanessa? And how far would they go to cover up what really happened? That first week after Vanessa disappeared was filled with confusion and growing fear. Her mother, Gloria, kept calling her phone, praying to hear her daughter's voice. Each call went unanswered. When she demanded answers from the army, she was met with silence, red tape, and official statements that felt cold and rehearsed. How could her daughter be missing on a secure base, surrounded by soldiers, cameras, and patrols? For Vanessa's sisters, the questions burned even deeper. They knew what she had confided, that she was being harassed, cornered, and humiliated by someone in uniform. The idea that this was connected to her disappearance grew more real with every passing day. If she had been silenced, what did that say about the culture inside Fort Hood? Meanwhile, search teams combed the grounds. Volunteers, family, and strangers alike walked the fields, ditches, and wooded areas around the base. Flyers with Vanessa's photo were taped to shop windows, telephone poles, and car windshields across Texas. Her face became impossible to ignore. As days turned into weeks, frustration erupted. Community members and activists began to gather outside the gates of Fort Hood, holding signs and chanting her name. Her story was no longer just about one missing soldier. It was about every soldier who had ever been harassed, assaulted, or silenced by fear of retaliation. The movement carried a new rallying cry: "We won't stop until Vanessa is found." Inside the base, whispers grew louder. Some soldiers knew more than they were willing to admit. Others feared for their own safety if they spoke. The atmosphere was heavy, filled with suspicion and unease. And still, Vanessa was missing. No trace of her body, no sign of struggle, only the haunting reality of her belongings left behind. The unanswered question hung over everyone's head. Was Vanessa still alive, waiting for help that never came? Or had the army already failed her in the most devastating way? The protests outside Fort Hood grew louder each day. Families held photos of their own loved ones who had served and suffered in silence. Some were survivors of harassment, others carried memories of those who never came home. Vanessa's disappearance had struck a chord that could no longer be ignored. Her name was being spoken in cities far beyond Texas, and her story was shared across social media with one powerful message. This could happen to anyone in uniform. Inside the base, the investigation seemed to crawl. Weeks had passed, yet officials repeated the same rehearsed lines. "We are doing everything we can." But to Vanessa's family, it felt like the army was guarding its reputation more than protecting its soldiers. Her mother stood before cameras, begging for answers in Spanish, her voice trembling, yet unbreakable. Her pain was raw, but her determination was stronger. National news outlets began to cover the case, and suddenly Vanessa's photo was on every screen. Lawmakers started asking questions. Celebrities amplified her story. What had once been a quiet tragedy was now a national scandal. The army could no longer keep this in the shadows, but behind closed doors, disturbing details were surfacing. Investigators learned that Vanessa had been working in the armory under the supervision of a fellow soldier, Specialist Aaron David Robinson. He had a history of troubling behavior, and whispers spread that he had been the last person to see her alive. Still, no arrest was made. Every passing day felt like a lifetime. The family wondered, was Vanessa trapped somewhere, waiting to be rescued? Or was the truth far darker, hidden beneath layers of silence, fear, and denial? The unanswered questions weren't just haunting her loved ones. They were echoing across the nation, building pressure on Fort Hood to finally break its silence. As the weeks stretched into months, frustration boiled over. Vanessa's family demanded transparency, but answers came slowly, as though every truth had to be pulled out one painful piece at a time. Investigators finally began connecting the dots, and one name kept circling back: Specialist Aaron David Robinson. He had worked with Vanessa in the armory the day she disappeared. He was young, quiet to some, but others remembered his short temper and his controlling nature. Robinson was questioned early on, but nothing concrete tied him to Vanessa's disappearance, at least not at first. He told investigators he hadn't seen anything unusual, but something about his story felt rehearsed, almost too neat. Meanwhile, Vanessa's belongings, left inside that armory, spoke louder than his words. Outside the gates, the protests grew into national headlines. Politicians demanded independent investigations into Fort Hood. Why were so many soldiers reported missing, assaulted, or even dead on this one base? Why did silence seem to be the default response? Vanessa's case had pulled back the curtain on a much bigger problem. Her sisters, driven by grief and anger, became her voice. They stood before cameras, not as activists, but as family, refusing to let her name be buried under bureaucracy. "My sister deserves justice," they cried, and people across the country listened. Behind the scenes, tips began to surface. Witnesses claimed Robinson had been acting strangely after Vanessa vanished. He was seen leaving the base with suspiciously large containers. At the time, no one questioned it. Now, those details felt chilling. The investigation tightened its focus. Robinson was no longer just a soldier among many. He was becoming the prime suspect. And yet, with every delay, every vague response, the family feared the truth was slipping further away. The world wanted answers. The GuillÉN family wanted their daughter back. And all eyes were on Robinson, the last man to see Vanessa alive. By late June, the search for Vanessa had turned desperate. Volunteers scoured fields and riverbanks while her family pleaded in front of cameras for help. The army insisted it was investigating, but public trust was already broken. For many, it felt as though the family was doing more to find Vanessa than the institution sworn to protect her. Behind the scenes, the focus on Robinson grew sharper. Investigators tracked his movements, piecing together fragments of testimony. A fellow soldier mentioned Robinson had been acting nervous, constantly checking his phone, pacing in silence. Another recalled seeing him struggling with something heavy near his car. At first, these details seemed random. Together, they painted a chilling picture. Then came the tip that changed everything. On June 30th, searchers combing an area near the Leon River made a grisly discovery. Human remains buried in a shallow grave. The news spread like wildfire. Hope drained into heartbreak. The location was just miles from Fort Hood, an area Robinson had reportedly visited. The suspicion was no longer abstract. It was concrete, horrifying, undeniable. As investigators pressed harder, Robinson realized the walls were closing in. On July 1st, he fled the base. Police tracked him down, but before he could be taken into custody, he pulled out a gun and ended his own life. Just like that, the man at the center of the mystery was gone, leaving behind more questions than answers. Meanwhile, another figure stepped into focus: Robinson's girlfriend, Cecily Aguilar. She admitted to helping him dispose of Vanessa's body, describing how they had tried to destroy evidence and hide what they had done. Her confession confirmed what the family had feared all along. Vanessa had not simply disappeared. She had been silenced. The discovery shattered the community, but it also hardened their resolve. Vanessa's name became more than a tragedy. It became a demand for justice, echoing through every protest, every headline, every heartbroken voice asking, how could this have happened on U.S. soil, inside a military base? Days after Robinson took his own life, investigators confirmed what everyone feared. The remains found near the Leon River belonged to specialist Vanessa GuillÉN. On July 6th, the Army released the official confirmation. Her family's worst nightmare had become reality. For months, they had clung to the possibility that she might still be alive, hidden, waiting. Now that hope was gone. The news devastated the community, but it also ignited outrage. How could a young soldier vanish, be murdered, and hidden so close to base without anyone noticing? How could her cries for help, her warnings about harassment, be ignored until it was too late? These were not just questions for Fort Hood. They were questions for the entire U.S. Army. Protesters filled the streets with renewed energy. Crowds gathered in Washington, D.C., Houston, Los Angeles, and beyond, chanting Vanessa's name. For many service members, veterans, and families, her story was personal. It symbolized years of silence, fear, and unspoken trauma. Inside Fort Hood, pressure mounted. Commanders faced accusations of negligence, cover-ups, and failure to protect their soldiers. Investigations expanded, digging into not only Vanessa's case, but also a troubling pattern of violence and abuse on the base. Reporters uncovered statistics that shocked the public. Fort Hood had one of the highest rates of sexual harassment, assault, and soldier deaths in the Army. For the GuillÉN family, grief transformed into determination. They refused to let Vanessa's name fade into another statistic. Her sisters stood on podiums, speaking directly to lawmakers. Her mother, still grieving, became a symbol of resilience, demanding justice for her daughter and change for every soldier who came after her. Vanessa's case was no longer just a tragedy. It was a catalyst, a mirror reflecting the deep cracks in a system built on silence and fear. And now, those cracks were impossible to ignore. The confirmation of Vanessa's death demanded accountability. Public pressure was unrelenting, and soon the Army had no choice but to open the gates of Fort Hood to outside scrutiny. An independent civilian review board was assembled, tasked with uncovering not just what happened to Vanessa, but why so many warning signs were ignored. The findings were damning. Investigators described Fort Hood as an environment where sexual harassment and assault were not only common, but too often dismissed or ignored. Soldiers feared retaliation if they spoke out. Commanders failed to act on reports. Cases piled up with little resolution. In their words, it was a culture of fear and silence, one that left Vanessa vulnerable and ultimately cost her life. The fallout was immediate. 14 senior officers and leaders at Fort Hood were relieved of duty or disciplined. It was one of the largest accountability actions in modern Army history. But for many, it still felt like too little, too late. Leaders might lose their positions, but the system that allowed Vanessa's death had been in place for decades. Her family, meanwhile, continued to fight in public. They stood on courthouse steps, marched with protesters, and met with lawmakers in Washington. Their grief became a movement, their sorrow transformed into advocacy. "We will not stop," her sister said, "until no soldier has to live in fear again." The story was no longer about one base in Texas. It became a national reckoning. Service members across the country began sharing their own experiences with harassment and retaliation, often for the first time. The phrase, "I am Vanessa GuillÉN," wasn't just a slogan. It was a confession, a demand for change, and a unifying cry for justice. Vanessa's case had forced the Army to confront a truth it could no longer hide. And yet, her family believed the fight was far from over. The real question now was whether this tragedy could spark true reform, or whether history would repeat itself once the headlines faded. Outrage over Vanessa's death soon turned into action on Capitol Hill. Lawmakers, pressed by the GuillÉN family and thousands of voices across the nation, began drafting legislation to address the failures that had cost her life. For years, the military's system for handling harassment and assault cases had been criticized. Victims were often forced to report abuse to the very chain of command that failed them, leaving many silenced in fear. Vanessa's story exposed those cracks to the world. The proposal was called the "I am Vanessa GuillÉN Act." Its purpose was clear: create a safer, more transparent system where victims of harassment and assault could come forward without fear of retaliation. It sought to move investigations outside the immediate chain of command to independent authorities who could act fairly. It aimed to protect whistleblowers, increase oversight, and demand accountability from leadership. For the GuillÉN family, the fight was personal but also universal. They walked the halls of Congress, meeting with senators and representatives, carrying photos of Vanessa as both a reminder and a plea. Their pain became the driving force behind a bill that promised real change. They refused to let her death be just another tragedy buried in silence. The bill gained bipartisan support. Politicians who rarely agreed on anything found common ground in the urgency of reform. Service members testified, survivors shared stories, and slowly the act gathered momentum. Each step forward was a testament to the power of Vanessa's legacy. On the streets, the movement continued. Rallies, vigils, and marches echoed with her name. People carried signs demanding justice, not only for Vanessa, but for every soldier who had been ignored. The nation had reached a tipping point, and the pressure on the military was unlike anything it had faced in decades. Vanessa's story was no longer just about the past. It was shaping the future, rewriting laws, changing systems, and ensuring that her voice, though silenced in life, would speak loudly in reform. The "I am Vanessa GuillÉN Act" marked a turning point, but legislation alone could not erase decades of silence. What it did accomplish was spark a cultural shift. Soldiers across the country began to feel empowered to speak, to tell their own stories of harassment and retaliation without fear of being ignored. The movement had broken the dam, and voices once silenced were now flooding into the open. For the military, the changes were profound. New systems were implemented to ensure reports of harassment and assault bypassed immediate commanders. Independent investigators were brought in, creating a layer of protection between victim and abuser. The law demanded accountability where there had once been secrecy. For many, it was the first glimmer of hope that justice was possible inside the ranks. But the impact stretched far beyond the army. Vanessa's name became a symbol in schools, on college campuses, and in workplaces where survivors of harassment saw their own pain reflected in her story. Social media kept her memory alive with a powerful message. No one should suffer in silence, and no institution is above accountability. Her family, though forever grieving, carried themselves with remarkable strength. They spoke not only of the daughter and sister they lost, but of the thousands of others who would be protected because of her. Each time they appeared before cameras or crowds, they reminded the world that Vanessa's life had meaning, and her death demanded change. The act was not the end, it was a beginning. It forced leaders to look inward, to confront the toxic patterns that had long been ignored. While progress was slow, the cultural ripple Vanessa created was undeniable. She had become more than a victim of tragedy. She was now the face of reform, a lasting reminder that silence can be broken.
And justice, however delayed, can still be pursued. Vanessa GuillÉN's story does not end with her death, nor even with the law that bears her name. Her legacy lives on in the countless lives she touched, those who never knew her personally, but who saw in her a reflection of themselves, of their daughters, sisters, and friends. She became a symbol of courage, not because she survived, but because even in silence, her truth forced a nation to listen. Every vigil, every march, every sign held high with her photo carried the same message. Vanessa mattered. Her life mattered. And the system that failed her could not continue unchanged. In that way, she accomplished what few ever could. She forced one of the largest institutions in the country to confront its own flaws. For her family, the pain will never disappear. The empty seat at the table, the quiet moments when her laugh is missing, the milestones she never reached, those wounds remain. But they have also chosen to transform that pain into purpose. They travel, they speak, they remind the world that behind every headline is a human being, a family forever altered. The military continues to struggle with the challenges Vanessa's case exposed, but her name is now woven into its history. She is remembered not only as a soldier, but as the spark that ignited reform. And each time a survivor steps forward, each time a leader is held accountable, her story echoes. True crime often leaves us with horror, with anger, with grief. But Vanessa's story leaves us with something more, a demand to do better, to listen when voices are trembling, to act before tragedy strikes, to believe survivors, even when it is inconvenient. Vanessa GuillÉN was a daughter, a sister, a soldier, and now she is also a legacy, one that reminds us all that silence can be broken, and that change, however slow, is always possible when people refuse to look away. If Vanessa's story touched you, please consider subscribing to this channel. It helps us continue telling important stories that deserve to be heard. And I'd love to hear your thoughts. What part of this story impacted you the most? Leave a comment below and let's keep the conversation going.